April 17th, 1945. 14,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. The cockpit rattled with turbulence. Sweat traced along Lieutenant Jack Thomas's jawline as he adjusted his grip on the control stick. The sun glared off the waves below like polished steel. And all around him, nothing but blue sky, broken only by black dots climbing fast. Zeros. At least 20 of them. He was alone now. What started as a routine recon over Leyte had gone south fast. His squadron, 5 Hellcats and 2 bombers, had been ambushed just east of the Gulf. Radio silence from Japanese forces had fooled command into thinking the airspace was clear. But it wasn't. The 343rd Kokutai, Japan's elite air group, had been waiting. Now the bombers were gone. His wingmen shot down or lost in the clouds. The sky had turned into a graveyard in under 5 minutes. Jack Thomas, 22 years old, lean as a fence post, and fresh from Clay County, Kansas, was the only one left. Back home, people called him Stick. Not because he was skinny, though he was, but because he'd spent more time with his hands on a flight stick than a tractor wheel. He could fly anything with wings, had been doing it since age 13, buzzing over wheat fields in a patched-up crop duster his dad swore would fall apart every time he took it up. But Jack had a knack, not just flying, reading the wind, feeling pressure changes, knowing what was about to happen 3 seconds before it did. That gut instinct had saved him more than once, and now he'd need every bit of it. One of the Zeros broke formation, charging in from the high right, its nose blinking with 7.7 millimeter fire. Jack didn't climb. He cut throttle and rolled hard left, dropping like a brick. The Zero overshot, confused by the sudden stall. Jack yanked the stick back, rolled inverted, and lined up the nose. One squeeze. Smoke. The Japanese fighter banked hard and fell away, trailing flame. But there were more. So many more. He snapped his head left. 2 more Zeros were diving toward him. He pushed the throttle forward, the Hellcat's massive Pratt & Whitney engine roaring like a wounded animal. It wasn't the fastest plane in the war, but it was tough. Jack knew it could take a few hits. He'd have to let it. As tracers zipped past the canopy, Jack banked again, not out, but toward the enemy. Straight into their guns. It was the kind of move that made flight instructors scream back at the training base. But Jack wasn't thinking like a Navy pilot. He was thinking like a farm kid in a cornfield. Growing up, he used to race dust storms, flying low to the ground, skimming over fences, flipping the wings just above scarecrows. He'd learned to fly under pressure when the wind shifted fast and birds exploded out of nowhere. Flying wasn't just muscle memory, it was rhythm, timing, gut feel. He dove low and then snapped up, forcing the pursuing Zeros into a steep climb. One hesitated. That was enough. Jack spun into a corkscrew, flipped over the top, and rolled behind the slower plane. One more burst. Another Zero spiraled into the sea. 2 down. He didn't smile, didn't flinch, just scanned for the next threat. The radio crackled with static, then a voice, faint, broken. Tomcat 3, anyone left? It was Ensign Lowry, his youngest wingman. Jack keyed his mic. I'm up. Don't come back. It's a beehive out here. Roger. Good luck, Stick. The line went dead. Jack exhaled through his nose. The sky felt tighter now. He checked altitude, 11,200 feet. Fuel was okay. Ammo, not great. The next wave was forming, 6 Zeros in line abreast. Coordinated, disciplined. These weren't rookies. These were men who'd fought over Guadalcanal, who'd flown against B-29s and lived to tell it. Jack's fingers curled tight around the trigger. He didn't plan on surviving. He planned on making them earn every inch of sky. And then, in a split second, he saw it. A reflection? No, a gap. A timing window in their formation. Just wide enough for a slingshot turn he'd invented as a kid, dodging between windbreaks and grain silos. It was suicidal unless it worked. And if it did, he could break the line, split their attack, pick them off, just like chasing crows over the wheat. Jack pulled the stick. The Hellcat roared. The trick was about to begin. Jack's gloved fingers tightened around the stick. The Hellcat shuddered as he yanked it into a hard left bank. But not just any turn. This was a move that only made sense if you'd flown with fence posts and barn roofs as your pylons. Back in Kansas, he called it the slingshot. You dove, pulled tight, then let the rudder whip the plane around like a rock in a sling. He'd done it 100 times between trees and grain silos, skimming the ground so low that chickens scattered. It was fast, wild, and impossible to track. But never, not once, had he tried it with 5 enemy aircraft, bearing down at full throttle. Now was the time. The Zeros opened fire. Orange tracers streaked past his canopy. One round punched through his left wing. He felt the jolt through the frame, but didn't flinch. He was already diving. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. The sea glittered like shattered glass. At 7,000 feet, he jerked the stick back with a snap and kicked hard right on the rudder. The Hellcat groaned. The G-forces slammed into his chest. His vision narrowed. Blood drained from his head. But the aircraft spun, whipped around at a tight radius no textbook would ever recommend. Behind him, the lead Zero overshot, not expecting the sudden turn. Jack's guns roared. The Japanese plane bucked in the air and peeled away, trailing smoke and flame before it dropped nose first into the ocean. 3 down. The remaining Zeros broke formation. The slingshot had worked. Jack had split their attack. He didn't just survive, he'd forced them to scatter. It gave him a precious 5 seconds of space. And in aerial combat, 5 seconds could be the difference between a kill and a funeral. Jack leveled out, pulled the nose slightly above the horizon, and scanned the sky. He spotted 2 Zeros trying to regroup to his right, circling like sharks. Below them, another was climbing fast to his belly, trying to sneak in under his blind spot. Not today, Jack muttered. He flipped his Hellcat sideways and dove again. Not away, but toward the climber. At 300 miles per hour, both planes closed the gap like bullets in opposing barrels. Jack had seconds. He lined up the shot, held his breath, then fired. The tracers chewed through the Zero's cowling. It erupted in a flash of fire and smoke. The pilot didn't eject. Jack didn't watch it fall. 4. His breath came in short bursts now. His forehead was slick with sweat. The Hellcat's left wing fluttered slightly. That earlier hit must have clipped part of the control surface. But she was still flying, still angry. The sky around him was chaos. The remaining Zeros were darting through cloud breaks, regrouping in pairs. Jack knew their game. They wanted to tire him out, make him burn fuel, break his rhythm. But he'd flown alone before. Hours at a time, just him and the wind and the engine's roar. He wasn't about to let them set the pace. He climbed. Slowly, deliberately. Back home, his father always said, "You don't chase the fox when it wants you to. You make it come to you." At 12,000 feet, Jack cut throttle and let the Hellcat drift for a moment. He played dead, nose slightly down, wings level, like a bird that's lost its lift. It worked. 1 Zero dove straight at him, thinking it was a free kill. Jack flipped the engine back to full power, jerked the stick, and looped around the attacker like a spring trap. He fired. 5. Below, he saw pieces of the wreckage splash into the waves. He didn't have time to feel anything. Not pride, not relief, just pressure, just motion. But something was changing. The Zeros weren't flying as tight now. Their maneuvers, once sharp and practiced, were looser, hesitant. Jack realized what was happening. They thought they were chasing a rookie. Now they weren't sure what they were dealing with. One Hellcat should have been easy pickings. But this one fought like a ghost, like it knew what they'd do before they did. Because Jack didn't just fly, he hunted. From the fields of Kansas to the clouds over Lady, he'd always believed flying was like listening to music. If you could feel the rhythm, you could control the dance. And right now, Jack was leading. The Hellcat's engine thundered like a drumbeat behind Jack's ears as he leveled off again, scanning the sky like a hawk above a hayfield. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was commanding the airspace. With 5 kills already confirmed and more enemy fighters circling like vultures, the odds were still stacked against him. But for the first time in the fight, he wasn't reacting. They were. He dipped his left wing, just slightly. Bait. A feint, nothing more. But 2 Zeros took it. They dove. Jack didn't. Instead, he pulled high and hard, arcing into a climb the Japanese pilots hadn't expected. His altitude climbed rapidly, 13,000, 14,000 feet. He rolled over the top of the loop, let the nose drop, and fell back into the dive, now behind them. They had no idea he was there. He opened fire. The first Zero lit up immediately. Flames burst from the engine cowling. The second tried to brake left, but Jack was faster. He adjusted, trimmed the rudder, and squeezed the trigger. 2 more enemy fighters spiraled toward the sea. 7. And just like that, the rhythm was his again. He could almost hear his younger self laughing, arms out wide, pretending to be a fighter plane while running through cornfields, dodging scarecrows, barking like a machine gun. That was the beginning. This was just the grown-up version. But the stakes now were real. Jack glanced at the instrument panel. Fuel, below 40%. Ammo, half gone. Damage light on the left wing was blinking. He knew he didn't have the luxury of another full engagement. Not unless he got creative. He wasn't done yet. Through a break in the clouds, Jack spotted 2 Zeros chasing something far in the distance. A silver glint, trailing smoke. Another Hellcat. No. A bomber. A lone American torpedo bomber, slow, wounded, and crawling toward safety. It didn't stand a chance. Jack didn't hesitate. He kicked the rudder and dove. The wind screamed against the canopy as the Hellcat plummeted. The 2 Zeros were locked onto the bomber's tail, slowly reeling it in. Their guns began to fire. Jack saw the tracer rounds streak through the air. He had 15 seconds to intervene. 10 seconds. The bomber's left engine caught fire. It wobbled, dropped slightly, held course. 5 seconds. Jack rolled to the right, lined up his sight, and opened up with both barrels. One of the Zeros disintegrated in a fireball. Pieces of its fuselage tearing through the sky like shrapnel. The other Zero tried to break off, but it was too late. Jack stayed on it, calm as if he were lining up a fence post for painting. One burst, then another. The Zero exploded just above the ocean. 9. The bomber was still flying. Smoke billowed from one wing, but it climbed slightly, angling toward the clouds. "Whoever you are," Jack said aloud, "get home." He pulled back up, eyes scanning for the next threat. But the sky felt different now. Quieter. The Japanese fighters were breaking away, retreating. The rhythm had broken for them, and Jack knew why. In combat, confidence is as dangerous as bullets, and and he had just taken theirs. Still, it wasn't over. From the far west, a final group of 4 Zeros began to close in, likely from the original ambush group. Jack could almost picture their faces, angry, embarrassed, determined not to let one American pilot humiliate them. They came in hot. Jack stayed calm. He didn't climb, he didn't run. He coasted level, just like he used to when prairie winds turned rough and visibility dropped. Then, with perfect timing, he turned the Hellcat sideways and nosed into a shallow dive. Not to flee, but to draw them down, spread them out. A classic funnel move. As expected, 1 Zero broke formation early. Jack snapped a barrel roll underneath it and looped back behind. Guns blazed. The Zero lit up, spiraling into the sea. 10. The others scattered. Jack climbed again, this time slower, cautious. He was running low on ammunition, but now it was psychological. Every burst had to count. He watched them, their hesitation growing. And deep inside, Jack felt it again. He was still dancing. Jack could feel the tremble in his wings, not from fear, but from the stress on the airframe. He'd pushed the Hellcat farther than it was meant to go, but she held, just like the family's old biplane back in Kansas. The one with patched fabric wings and oil-stained controls that somehow never quit, no matter how rough the ride got. His heart was pounding, but his hand stayed steady. The sky was wide open now, with clouds like torn sheets and sunlight flashing across the sea below. The remaining Zeros circled warily at a distance, like wolves unsure if the prey was worth it anymore. They had the numbers, but something in their rhythm had cracked. Jack didn't need a mirror to know it. He could feel it. The hesitation in their turns, the twitchy rudder corrections, the way they flew close together now, no longer stretching wide and bold like they had at the start. They were second-guessing. And that, Jack knew, was the opening. He remembered something his uncle used to say when they herded cattle. If you break the lead bull, the whole herd loses its nerve. Jack picked the lead Zero, the one flying slightly ahead of the others, a touch higher, confident but cautious. That was the man holding the rest together. Jack didn't charge in. He drifted upward, slow and graceful, the Hellcat nosing toward the sun like a lazy hawk catching thermals. He wanted the Zero to see him, to think he was tired, stretching altitude, maybe even climbing out to run. The bait worked. The leader peeled away, turning to intercept. Jack whispered to himself, "Come on, just like back home." As the Zero closed, Jack cut power for a half second, then dropped the nose and rolled inverted. A half snap, the kind of move that would get you kicked out of flight school if you didn't know exactly what you were doing. But Jack had done it before. Not in war, but in open fields, where he'd dive between silos, loop under telephone wires, and buzz the neighbor's pond so low the ducks would dive. He rolled out of the spin directly under the Zero and came up behind it so fast the enemy pilot had no time to react. Jack's guns chattered. Short, controlled bursts. The Zero burst into flames mid-turn, cartwheeling into the deep blue below. 11. Jack didn't wait to celebrate. The remaining 2 fighters turned sharply, trying to double back and catch him in a pincer. But this time, Jack had room. He climbed straight into the sun, a blinding angle that turned his aircraft into a silhouette. The Hellcat vanished into light. The trick was simple. If they chased him, they'd lose him in the glare. If they didn't, he could swing wide and come down behind them. They chased. Jack looped wide, counting silently as he came around. 3, 2, 1. He rolled hard and dropped straight down. They never saw him coming. Jack hit the trailing Zero first, not with a full burst, but enough. Tracer rounds peppered its fuselage. It broke off, trailing oil, spinning toward the horizon. The last Zero snapped into a dive, trying to escape. Jack followed. They dropped together, 12,000 feet, 10,000, 8,000. The roar of the engine climbing with every second. Jack trimmed the aircraft, held steady. The Zero juked left, then right. It was fast, but it was also desperate. He waited. No rush, no panic, just rhythm. The pilot finally banked hard left, a sharp, evasive turn that bled speed. Jack pulled in behind and squeezed the trigger. The Zero jerked midair, then spiraled down in a black streak. 13. Jack exhaled slowly. And then, silence. No more tracers. No engines howling. No angry Zeros climbing through cloud breaks. Just the wind. Just the hum of his own aircraft, battered but breathing. He leveled off and checked the horizon. Nothing. The sky was his. For a moment, he let it sink in. Not as a soldier, not as a fighter pilot, but as a Kansas kid who once tied a red scarf to a broomstick and called it a tail fin. Now, that kid had just cleared the air over the Philippine Sea, alone. The sky was still, eerily still. Jack leaned back in the seat, his gloves loose on the stick, trying to catch his breath. The sun had shifted west, casting long shadows across the Pacific below. 13 enemy planes, and only one Hellcat had come out flying, but Jack knew better than to relax. He glanced at the ammo gauge. Empty. He tapped the glass, as if that might change it. Nothing. The barrels had gone dry. All that remained was his engine, his instincts, and a frame full of bullet holes holding together with a prayer. Then came the sound, a low rumble in the distance, faint at first, but growing louder. Jack squinted toward the horizon. There, a black dot. Then two, then more. Zeros. Again. He counted fast, 4, maybe 5. No formation this time. Just a pack, scattered and desperate. They must have been stragglers from another patrol, summoned by radio. Reinforcements. And Jack had nothing left to shoot with. He could try to run, maybe dive low, weave through the clouds, and hope they lost him. But something in his gut said they'd catch up. His fuel was low, his plane was damaged. And worse, they likely knew he was out of firepower. So he made a decision. No radio. No plea for help. Just fly. Jack pulled the Hellcat into a slow climb, not aggressive, just enough to show confidence. If they thought he still had ammo, they might hesitate. He angled the plane toward a nearby cloud bank, letting the white mist swallow him whole. Inside, everything went quiet. Visibility dropped to feet. It was the kind of environment that would make most pilots back off. But Jack had grown up flying in worse. Kansas fog thicker than soup. Mornings where the sun didn't show until noon. He trusted his instruments and his gut. And he had one last move. It was something he'd only tried once. A reversal trick, a snapback turn he'd learned chasing sparrows through a barn loft. It wasn't in any Navy manual. It relied on muscle memory and gravity more than science. But it just might save him. He kept flying straight through the clouds. The Zeros followed. He could feel it. Engines closing in, slicing the air like razors. At the last second, Jack cut power, slammed the rudder, and pulled the stick into his lap. The Hellcat kicked sideways, almost stalling, then whipped around like a bucking horse. The lead Zero blew past him, engine screaming. No time to shoot. Jack couldn't. He was out of ammo anyway. But the Zero didn't know that. Jack faked an attack run, diving on the tail, close enough that the Japanese pilot panicked. The Zero banked hard right, then snapped left, overcorrecting. Its wing caught the tip of the cloud bank. The pressure folded it. The plane tumbled and vanished into mist. 4 left. Jack didn't wait. He used the same trick again, darting into a steep climb, then rolled over the top and dropped behind the next aircraft. He stayed on its 6, flying so close that the Zero began to zigzag wildly. No shots, no bullets, just presence. He mimicked a firing run. The pilot flinched. The Zero dipped suddenly and went into a dive, too sharp. It didn't pull out. Jack pulled away, watching the splash far below. 3 left. That's when they caught on. The remaining pilots spread out wide, smarter now. They'd realized the Hellcat wasn't firing, and that made Jack just a fast-moving shell in the sky. But he still had something. He flew straight at the center Zero, head on. It was a bluff. The Japanese pilot hesitated, rolled left. Jack adjusted and followed. The 2 other Zeros closed from either side. A trap. Jack knew it, but he also knew how to break it. He pulled the stick hard, climbed vertical, nearly straight up, and then kicked the rudder into a stall. The Hellcat flipped, drifted, and came back down nose first between the 2 flankers. No bullets, but the dive alone split their angle. 1 Zero veered off. The other twisted too sharp. It collided with the lead aircraft. A mid-air flash, wings, flame, smoke. 2 down, not by gunfire, but by mistake. 1 Zero left. Jack rolled out and leveled, his engine coughing now. The final enemy fighter hovered far out, circling him, not approaching. It had seen everything, and it didn't want to be number 14. The Zero turned and disappeared into the clouds. Jack stayed steady. No celebration, no cheers, just a breath. The fight, at last, was over. Jack adjusted his grip on the throttle, nudging the Hellcat into a slow turn, eyes scanning the horizon one last time. Nothing, not even a speck. The last Zero had vanished like a ghost in the cloud bank, too proud to surrender, but too shaken to press the fight. He was alone. Again. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by a sharp awareness of just how broken his aircraft was. The engine coughed every few seconds. Fuel was dangerously low. His guns were dry. Control surfaces had taken damage from stray rounds. And he still had hundreds of miles between him and base. His fingers moved to the radio dial, cycling through channels. Tomcat 3. This is Tomcat 3. Does anyone read? Static. Valkyrie lead, this is Tomcat 3. Do you copy? More static. Just the distant hum of an empty frequency. Jack leaned back and exhaled slowly. The silence felt heavier than the dogfight. He wasn't afraid, not exactly. But there was a strange kind of quiet that came after surviving something no one should. It was the same silence he remembered from winter mornings in Kansas, stepping outside after a blizzard had passed, when the snow covered everything and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. He let the Hellcat drift east. There were no landmarks out here, only the open sea and sky. But Jack had always been good with direction. Even as a kid, he could close his eyes and point home. His mother used to call it the compass in his bones. That compass was guiding him now. He flew low, just a few thousand feet above the ocean, saving fuel. The sea below was calm, glittering in the late afternoon sun, rippled only by the ghost trails of lost planes and shattered moments. Somewhere down there, 13 enemy fighters lay buried beneath the waves, and not a single one had taken him with them. Jack wasn't a killer. He didn't feel proud, but he knew what he'd done had saved lives. Maybe that torpedo bomber's crew, maybe others who'd be flying through this airspace tomorrow. He reached under the seat, pulling out the worn photograph wedged between the emergency map and his flare gun. His kid's sister, Mary, and their dog, Boomer. The picture was faded now, creased from the dozen times he'd pulled it out during missions. But it always brought him back to the smell of summer hay, the sound of screen doors slamming, and Boomer barking at tractors like they were invaders. He smiled, tired. Then his head jerked up. Movement to the north. Not planes. Smoke. Thick, black, curling into the air from something massive. Jack throttled forward, swinging wide. It wasn't a burning aircraft. This was different, darker, more sustained. Like an oil fire, or an engine room explosion. He descended cautiously. Within minutes, the source came into view. A U.S. Navy destroyer, listing slightly to starboard, smoke pouring from the rear deck. Her crew scrambled across the surface, some manning hoses, others waving signal flags in a flurry of urgency. She'd taken a hit. Maybe from a torpedo, maybe an airstrike. Jack circled once, low and slow. He reached for the radio again, switched to emergency rescue frequency. USS Fletcher, this is Tomcat 3. Friendly aircraft overhead. I see your distress signal. Requesting status, over. A crackle, then a voice. Tomcat 3, this is Fletcher Actual. We took a hit on the aft engine compartment. Fire is under control. Are you armed? Jack stared at the empty ammo gauge. Negative, Fletcher. Out of ammunition. Running low on fuel. I'm headed east, hoping to reach base. A pause. Copy that. Recommend visual recon sweep westward. Command believes another wave may be inbound. Can you hold position? Jack hesitated. He was empty. His bird was barely flying. He had every excuse to turn for home. But then he looked down again. At the crew, the smoke, the men hauling hoses, tending to the wounded, doing everything they could to stay afloat. If there was another attack coming, they wouldn't survive it alone. He keyed the mic. Fletcher, I'll stay as long as I can. The sky had tried to bury him today, but it hadn't. And until his wings gave out, Jack Thomas would keep flying. Jack circled above the USS Fletcher like a hawk with dull talons, his Hellcat dragging a shadow across the smoke-streaked water. Below, sailors moved with purpose, hosing down flames, signaling damage crews, tending to wounded sprawled across the deck. The destroyer was alive. Barely. And now he was its only eye in the sky. No bullets, no bombs. Just him, his plane, and whatever courage he had left in the tank. The radio hissed again. Tomcat 3, be advised. Fletcher radar picking up possible bogeys at 40 miles, bearing 252. Could be another sweep. We're blind to altitude. Can you get eyes? Jack's hand tightened on the stick. 40 miles west. That wasn't far. At cruising speed, he'd reach them in under 10 minutes. But every minute spent airborne pushed his luck. His fuel gauge sat low in the red, its needle twitching like a heartbeat. He looked out toward the horizon. Blue? Still. But something felt wrong. Like that sixth sense that creeps in when the barn goes quiet before a storm. He clicked the radio. Roger, Fletcher. I'll take a look. Jack banked left and nudged the Hellcat's nose down, building speed. The ocean rippled below, calm and endless, but his eyes stayed up, scanning the sky for motion, shape, shadow. At 15 miles out, he saw them. 3 shapes. Low and fast. Japanese bombers. Twin-engine Yokosuka P-1Y Francis. Sleek, fast, and deadly. designed to punch through naval defenses and deliver a payload straight to the heart of a fleet. They were headed straight for the destroyer. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over the trigger instinctively, then curled back, remembering nothing left. His guns had sung their last song. But he didn't break off. He did the only thing he could. He dove. The Hellcat dropped like a stone, slicing through cloud wisps, airspeed climbing. He angled hard toward the lead bomber, closing fast from above. He wanted them to see him, wanted them to think he was armed. The Japanese pilot scattered slightly, unsure. Jack came screaming past the lead Francis, so close he could see the nose gunner flinch behind the glass. He pulled up, looped around, and came back in again. Head on, like a charging bull. Still no shots. But the bluff worked. The lead bomber broke formation, veering right to avoid the intercept. The second bomber turned slightly left, straight into the path of the third. Confusion, delay, rhythm broken. Jack punched the throttle and sliced through the middle again, weaving dangerously between the trio, nearly clipping one of their wings. If he could buy just one more minute. He keyed the mic. "Fletcher, incoming. 3 bombers, 10 miles out. I've scattered the formation but can't stop 'em." "Copy that, Tomcat 3, came the voice. "All guns ready. ETA. 2 minutes." He wheeled the Hellcat around for one more pass, flying parallel to the bombers now, just above them. He rocked his wings, dipped down, made it look like an attack run. The Japanese gunners opened fire, but their aim was wild. Jack danced through the tracers, fearless now. He didn't have to fight. He just had to distract. The destroyer's silhouette came into view in the distance, a scarred hull bracing for impact. Then it started. Anti-aircraft guns lit up from the Fletcher's deck, 40mm Bofors and twin 5-inch mounts firing in furious unison. The sky above the ship turned into a thunderstorm of steel. Jack veered off, banking away as the lead bomber tried to line up its run. Too late. A direct hit from the destroyer's gun sent it spiraling into the sea, trailing smoke and flame. The second bomber tried to climb, but Jack dove in its path again, forcing it low. Another burst from the Fletcher. The second plane vanished in a fireball just short of the waves. Only one left. It turned wide, desperate to escape, when a final shot from the stern gun caught it square in the fuselage. It tore apart midair. 3 bombers down. No hits on the ship. Jack pulled back, gasping, soaked in sweat. His body trembled from exhaustion, but his heart beat steady. "Fletcher, you still floating?" "We're up. Thanks to you, Tomcat 3. That was some damn flying." He managed a tired grin. His Hellcat shook slightly. The engine was coughing louder now. But the sea was quiet again. The bluff had worked, and the farm kid with no bullets had just saved a destroyer. Jack's hands were cramping. He flexed his fingers, rolled his shoulders, and exhaled through gritted teeth. The engine noise had changed, deeper, rougher, like it was clearing its throat with every revolution. The Hellcat was running on fumes now, and so was he. Below, the USS Fletcher shrank in the distance, a battered gray line slicing through the Pacific. The sky was finally quiet. For now. Jack banked east, steady and low, conserving every drop of fuel. The gauges told a grim story, maybe 20 minutes of flight time left, tops. But there was no panic. He'd been watching this moment creep up for a while now. That's the thing about being alone in the sky. You know exactly when your luck starts to run dry. Still, he'd seen worse. Dusted crops with engines spitting smoke. Landed in windstorms so bad even the chickens hid. Flying wasn't about perfection. It was about getting home in one piece. He adjusted trim, scanned the sky, then looked out over the water. Somewhere beyond that horizon was the airstrip on Tacloban. Just a dirt patch with a windsock and a few jeeps. But it was home, if he could reach it. Suddenly, the radio clicked. Tomcat 3, this is Valkyrie Base. You copy? Jack blinked, surprised to hear a familiar voice. Loud and clear, Valkyrie. It's good to hear someone alive. You're not going to believe this, the voice said, half shouting over static. We thought you were dead. Your whole flight was gone. Nobody checked in. Jack glanced around the empty sky, then out toward the sea, where 13 Zeros and 3 bombers now rested on the ocean floor. Still here, he said. Barely. What's your status? Jack smirked. Out of ammo. Fuel's begging for mercy, and I might be flying with half a left wing. A pause. Then, you got enough to make it to Tacloban. Gonna try. Copy that. We're clearing the strip. Tower says you've got priority landing. Weather's fair. Wind's coming off the bay. Jack clicked twice in reply. He reached under the panel and tapped the fuel gauge with a knuckle. Still red, still dropping. His eyes scanned the ocean. No islands, no ships. Just the sun beginning to sag low behind him. The kind of light that made Kansas fields glow golden before dusk. He drifted back to a memory. 15 years old, flying his dad's crop duster with a cracked windshield and a broken fuel pump. Halfway through the route, the pump failed. He had 2 minutes before the engine died. He didn't panic then either. He'd landed in a hayfield so smooth it looked like a pool table. Today wasn't much different, just a longer runway and higher stakes. He pushed the nose down slightly, building airspeed without burning too much fuel. After 10 minutes, the first hills of Leyte appeared through the haze. Dark green fingers stretching up from the ocean like they were reaching to catch him. Then, finally, the airstrip. Tacloban. He keyed the radio again. Valkyrie Tower, this is Tomcat 3. Visual on the field. Tomcat 3, you're cleared to land. Bring her in easy. Medics are standing by. Jack chuckled. I'm fine. But the truth was, his arms ached. His back screamed. His mind felt like a fogged window barely clinging to clarity. He lined up the approach, flaps down, gear down. One last prayer that the hydraulics held. The Hellcat groaned as the gear locked with a heavy thunk. He adjusted for crosswind. The strip looked narrow. Closer, closer. The wheels touched down harder than he wanted. The Hellcat bounced once, then slammed down solid. The tires screamed against the dust, and the engine sputtered. He pulled the throttle back and let her coast to a stop. Silence. Then his canopy swung open. Hot air rushed in. Ground crew sprinted toward him, shouting, cheering. But Jack didn't move. He just sat there a moment longer, staring out at the sky. The same sky where he'd faced death, not once, but over and over. And somehow, come through. 13 Zeros. 3 bombers. No ammo. 1 worn-out Hellcat, and a Kansas farm kid who wouldn't quit. He finally climbed out, legs shaking. His boots hit the ground like they were made of lead. A crewman rushed up. Lieutenant, are you? Jack just raised a hand. I'm good. Then, after a beat, how's the ship, Fletcher? They radioed in. Took some damage, but they'll live. Jack nodded, slow. So would he. The wind kicked up fine dust across the tarmac as the sun dipped lower over Lady Gulf, casting long shadows behind the Hellcat's battered frame. A single bullet hole near the cowling still smoked faintly. One prop blade was nicked, and the left wing drooped like it had flown through a thunderstorm. Ground crews gathered around it like mechanics inspecting a relic from another time. Jack sat on a folding chair just outside the field tent, a canteen of warm water in one hand, his flight helmet still hanging from the other. His face was streaked with sweat and oil. His eyes hadn't stopped moving, not because of nerves, but habit. He was still flying up there in his head. A Navy intelligence officer, short, sharp, clipboard tucked tight under his arm, approached. "You the pilot from Tomcat 3? Jack glanced over, tired. "That's me. You land all those kills today?" Jack took a slow sip. "I didn't have time to count. Just tried to stay alive." The officer scribbled something, then looked up. "Word from Fletcher is you dropped 13 enemy planes before saving the ship from a bomber run." Jack shifted in his seat. More like the ship saved itself. I just flew in circles and scared the hell out of a few bombers. The man squinted at him. "You telling me you ran off 3 fully armed Yokosuka bombers with no ammo?" Jack nodded, deadpan. "Well, they didn't know that." There was silence for a beat. Then the officer barked out a laugh. "That might be the dumbest and bravest thing I've heard this war." Jack cracked a faint smile. Felt a little of both at the time. Across the airstrip, other pilots and crew had begun to gather. Word had traveled fast. The farm kid who downed a swarm. The Hellcat that wouldn't quit. It was becoming a story, passed around like a good ghost tale, the kind that pilots told to keep their edge sharp, or maybe just to believe that courage still mattered in a sky full of fire. A fellow pilot stepped up, blonde crew cut, grease still on his sleeves. "Hey, Stick, that's what they call you, right?" Jack nodded slowly. "They told us you took out an entire Zero Squadron solo. You some kind of magician?" Jack shrugged. "Just did what I was taught back home. When you can't outrun the storm, you ride it." Someone else spoke up. "He's getting written up. Saw the report. Navy Cross, maybe more." Jack looked down at his boots. He hadn't thought about medals, hadn't thought about much of anything except landing. His mind was still somewhere over the sea, dodging tracers, lining up impossible angles, tricking pilots into losing sight lines. It all felt far away now. The intelligence officer cleared his throat. "Command wants a full debrief. They're flying in someone from Admiral Nimitz's staff tomorrow." Jack stood slowly, his legs stiff. "Sure, I'll be ready." "By the way," the officer added, flipping through notes, "we pulled the records. You weren't even supposed to be in that flight today." Jack blinked. "What?" "You were a stand-in. Guy you replaced had engine trouble that morning." Jack let that settle. Fate had handed him a mission that wasn't even meant to be his. And somehow, he'd survived it. He looked up at the fading light, where the first stars were beginning to prick through the dusk. "I guess I drew the short straw." The officer shook his head. "If that's short, I'd hate to see long." As the others drifted away, Jack stayed near the wing of his Hellcat. He ran his hand along the chipped paint and bent metal. She had held together when everything else had fallen apart. A farm kid and a steel bird, both running on grit and instinct. He didn't know what came next. More missions, maybe promotion, maybe press. But right now, all he wanted was sleep. Real sleep. The kind where your bones stop buzzing. He took one last look at the empty sky and whispered, "Thanks for not giving up on me." The wind blew soft off the bay. The next morning broke quiet over Tacloban. The air smelled like motor oil and salt. A light breeze drifted through the tent flaps as Jack rolled his stiff shoulders and pulled on his flight jacket. He hadn't slept long, but it had been deep. The kind of sleep that came after giving everything, when the body finally surrendered. A jeep pulled up just past the command tent. A pair of officers stepped out. Clean uniforms, sharp creases, different from the mud-streaked crew on the line. One wore a Pacific Fleet staff insignia. The other carried a leather folder tucked under his arm like it held something heavier than paper. Jack stood as they approached. "Lieutenant Thomas?" the taller one asked. "That's me." The officer nodded, almost formally. "I'm Commander Hastings, dispatched from Admiral Nimitz's office. We've reviewed radio transcripts and gun camera footage. What little there was. Fletcher's logs confirm everything. You engaged and destroyed 13 confirmed enemy aircraft, executed multiple feint maneuvers without ammunition, and prevented a direct bomber strike on a U.S. naval vessel." Jack didn't reply. He wasn't sure what to say. The other officer, a wiry man with a tired face, opened the leather folder. Inside was a handwritten commendation form, clipped with a gold paperclip. He spoke quietly. "The Admiral would like to put you in for the Medal of Honor." Jack stared at it. He didn't move. Commander Hastings continued, voice calm. "You don't have to say anything. We'll handle the paperwork. You'll likely be reassigned back to the mainland for debrief and ceremony. Possibly a tour to promote war bonds. That's what they tend to do with pilots like you. Pilots like me." Jack looked past them, toward the airfield. His Hellcat sat off to the side, patched and hosed down, but still showing every scar. Crews had chalked a rough 13 on the fuselage near the nose. He could see a new squad of pilots getting ready, strapping into planes, checking gear, grinning nervously the way only rookies did before their first combat run. He remembered that feeling. "Sir," Jack said finally, "if it's all the same, I'd rather stay flying." The two officers exchanged a look. "You don't want to go home?" one asked. Jack shrugged. "I am home, up there." They didn't argue. They just nodded. Quiet understanding passed between men who'd seen enough of war to know that medals were one thing. But facing death and flying back through it, that lived in a different part of a man's soul. An hour later, Jack walked the flight line alone. He paused at his aircraft. The ground crew had already loaded fresh .50 caliber rounds into the wings. The fuel tanks were topped off. Someone had cleaned the canopy glass. It looked ready, tired, but loyal. Just like him. He climbed in slowly, the seat familiar now. Worn in the same way, an old saddle fit a favorite horse. As the engine roared to life, he gave the field crew a thumbs up. They waved, already backing away as dust kicked up in swirling columns. Jack taxied down the strip. Not for a mission, not yet. Just to feel the wheels lift, just to chase the wind again. He took off low and slow, climbing gradually into the morning light. Below, the base grew smaller, just another square carved out of jungle. The sea stretched wide, endless and blue. Up here, it was different. No medals, no reporters, no speeches. Just wind and horizon, just sky and memory. He flew a wide circle over the bay, then banked east, where more missions would come, where the fight wasn't finished. Not yet. And as he settled into his cruising altitude, the radio crackled. "Tomcat 3, this is Valkyrie Tower. Confirm your status?" Jack clicked his mic, smiled faintly, and replied in a voice steady as the wings beneath him. "Still flying."